Chapter 2. As his body hurtled towards the ground, Paul flailed in a desperate attempt to grab hold of something. Strangely, the opposite happened, as he felt something grab his ankles. The entire back of his body then slammed into the hard surface of what once was the witch's hat tower, and his descent slowed dramatically. He was being lowered while hanging upside down. Soon his hands touched the ground, and his body rolled over as whatever had held him released its grip. All he could see, though, when he looked for his salvation, was a rock surface heavily covered in thick vines. He sat there in shock, unable to process anything that had happened since his eyes opened after that kiss. Feeling this level of detachment from his usual understanding of reality was making him feel sick. Then he saw Ellie floating down before him, her arms outstretched like Jesus on the cross. No, he realized, she wasn't floating, not exactly. Vines were wrapped around her extremities, and when her feet touched the ground, they all uncoiled, retreating back to the surface of the rock. "Oh, thank the six, you're alive! I feared I hadn't caught you in time," Ellie said, kneeling down beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Are you hurt? I know this all must feel crazy to you, and I don't understand how this happened, but we need to move and get to the shelter of the woods." Paul looked at her for a moment and said, with confusion tinged with anger, "What did you do to me?" Ellie looked at him, first with hurt, then understanding. "I wish I could explain what is happening, and I don't know myself, really. All I can tell you is that we are no longer in Minneapolis, but we are in danger. We are far too visible on this hilltop," she said while scanning the sky. "I promise to tell you everything when we get somewhere safe." "Did you drug me?" Paul asked, not having heard anything she just said. "When we kissed, did you slip me acid or something? Because I'm either dreaming right now or hallucinating. Either way, I want to be in my room, in my bed." He stood up shakily, steadying himself, then turned and started to walk away. "When this wears off, whatever it is, Ellie grabbed his arm and spun him around. "Paul, your room is in a world unreachable to you. What's happening now is real. Please, I need you to come with me." Paul pulled away from her hold. His panic intensified, and he started running. He fled downhill, hoping to see buildings, lampposts, pavement, anything to indicate he was in that small park surrounded by the city. Instead, as he went, the trees grew more closely together. In his momentum, it was getting difficult to avoid them. To his right, he heard a voice shout something unintelligible, and as he looked toward the source, he ran into a tree, knocking himself unconscious. Ellie watched Paul run off, then followed behind. She couldn't blame him for anything he said to her. She knew this was incomprehensible to him. While she couldn't understand how they ended up in Tulath, the fact was she was back, and with a human in tow. Her first priority was getting them both to safety. She hoped that Paul would tire himself out, calm down, and begin to listen to her. As she contemplated all this, she heard a voice shout, "Stop!" then watched as Paul ran into a tree and collapsed to the ground. A figure appeared out of the trees and approached him, crouching down near his body. A hand reached out towards his head. "Do not touch him!" Ellie shouted. The figure looked her way, then stood to face her. Ellie recognized her sister. "Bellarania!" she shouted joyfully, running towards her. "Eltherea?" her sister answered, setting down the bow she was holding and moving towards her. The two embraced while Eltherea began to sob, overcome with emotion. When they finally parted, Bellarania looked at her sister, confusion on her face. "But why are you here?" Then taking a look at her up and down, added, "And why do you appear so strange? Your hair, and what manner of garments are these?" she asked, touching Eltherea's army jacket. "Things in other places have changed much since last we encountered humans. I would speak more on this, but, Paul." She looked over at his inert body. In her excitement at seeing her sister, she had forgotten about his accident. "If you speak of the human, he is unconscious. Beyond the nasty bump, it is difficult to tell how injured he truly is. There is little I can do for him here. Who is he, Eltherea?" "A friend. Somehow we traveled here to Tulath together. Now I fear I have put him in danger, unintentional as it was." "Put him in danger? Eltherea, you are the one who is in danger. It was only yesterday the ritual was performed. What do you think could have changed since then?" Ellie looked at her sister with shock. "But I have been in other place for a year. How is that possible? I know time flows differently there, but it has only been a day since you saw me last? Bellarani, I've missed you for so many days. I've had months to think on the wisdom of agreeing to leave here and wishing there was a way to get back to you. Now that I have, I wonder if it was fated that I return." "You believe it was the will of the Six? Why then let you cross over to other place only to return the next day? Seems like a cruel joke rather than the wisdom ascribed to them," Bellarania said uncertainly. "Still, you are here now, and I am glad for it, though I do not think Mother and Father will be." At the thought of her parents, Eltheria's heart leapt. She had not seen them in so long. But their discovery of her reappearance after just one day will be unwelcome news. "I suppose not, especially when I show up with my friend here," Eltherea said, gesturing to Paul. "Still, we must get to Chaness. It is the safest course of action for both of us. Are you with Sunset?" Bellarania smiled, whistled a short series of notes, and from out of the shadows of the trees trotted a horse with a dark crimson coat and a black mane. She came up to Eltherea, who placed her hand on her jaw and brought her forehead down on the muzzle. "I've missed you, my sweet girl, though I know for you it was just yesterday," she said. Sunset responded with a snort and a light stamp of her front hooves. Paul had come to, but was dizzy and unsteady on his feet. After saying something incoherent, Bellarani produced a vial from a satchel and made him drink it. He quickly fell asleep. She assured Eltherea that he would be okay. His brain just needed rest, and there would be more she could do in Chaness. They draped his body over the horse's back as if he were a slain deer and walked the path to the village. Along the way, Eltherea related to her sister some of the wonders and horrors of Other Place. How the people traveled in metal wagons that were fueled not by grains but by oil taken from the earth. How the refuse of these machines did not enrich the soil but instead poisoned the very air people breathed. That they used something called electricity, which was like harnessing the power of lightning. And while much of what she saw there disturbed her, there was much she found to love, like the music that was so different from anything heard in Tulath. To her it was as exciting as flying over the cliffs of the dead, trying to outpace an oncoming storm. Or, she was ashamed to say, the easily gotten food so full of unhealthy amounts of salt and sugar that she loved all the same. Bellarania listened to all these examples of Other Place with some interest, but it was all so bizarre and difficult for her to envision. Eventually she was lost in her own thoughts on how this human came to be here with her sister, and Eltheria's reaction when she believed what was a stranger had approached him. After Eltheria's admission of her love of something called junk food, Bellarani asked, "And this human, this Paul, do you love him as well? For you must know how dangerous he is to you, possibly to all of us." "Love? I've only known him a few days. But, Bellarani, he is not like the human Levi, nor is he like Raneth, or as he has become at least. Still, he does not belong in Tulath, and it is my hope that he can return to Other Place soon. I fear he will not survive here for long," she said, watching his prone body bobbing up and down as they traveled down the path. High above them a crow circled several times, then flew on. When the party crested the last hill and Chaness came into view below, Eltherea breathed in sharply. There was her home, the place that, for the last year, she had done her best to forget. When she fled to Other Place, there was no expectation of returning, no hope she would be with her family and friends again. Now that she was, she intended to stay. First, though, she must contend with her parents. As she thought this, a small bird landed on her sister's shoulder. "Pelmalith?" Bellarania asked. The bird tweeted in what sounded like a confirmation. She told it, "Go back to the village. Let all know that Eltherea has returned." She looked at Eltherea and said, "Perhaps a forewarning will lessen our parents' surprise upon your arrival." Eltherea hoped so, watching as the bird flew down to Chaness. They began their own much slower descent into the valley. A crowd awaited them when they walked through the tree archway and into the main circle. There were murmurs that grew louder as the realization spread of Sunset's unconscious passenger. Despite the shocked looks, Eltherea was happy to see every familiar face and had to restrain herself from embracing them all. A young elf approached them, whom she did hug, saying, "Thank you for spreading the word, Palmolith." He responded, "I for one am glad you're back, but your parents—" "Eltherea?" Eltherea's heart burst at the sound of that voice. She ran to her mother and held her tightly, crying over her shoulder. Her father stood by watching this with a furrowed brow until Eltherea tore herself away from her mother and threw her arms around him, burying her head into his chest. He looked over at his other daughter questioningly, to which Bellarania explained, "For her, it has been a year since she left." His expression softened as he pulled her away to look into her face. "But why have you returned?" Then looking over at Sunset to confirm what he had heard, "And why do you bring a man-child into Chaness?" Eltherea, gaining her composure and wiping the tears from her face, said, "He is hurt, father. Please, I will tell you all I can, but not here, not while he is like this." Her father looked at Paul's body slumped over the horse and was about to speak when her mother responded, "Bring him up to our weavling. We will tend to him there." Paul began to awaken, stretching his limbs and feeling relieved to be in bed. However, when he opened his eyes and things came into focus, he realized it wasn't his bed that he was in. He was in a small room that was filled with natural light and a breeze that felt to be coming directly from outside. An arched opening separated this room from a much larger one, where he could see figures gathered around a table. Just behind them was a tree trunk that spanned from floor to ceiling. In fact, every structure and furnishing within his view looked to be made from vines and branches, many twisting and intertwining in intricate ways. He tried to sit up, felt a sharp pain in his head, and then a hand pushed him back down onto his pillow. He turned to discover someone had been sitting next to the bed, and he looked up into a beautiful stranger's face. No, not completely strange, he realized. There were the eyes, of course, though the one blue eye was all the more brilliant in contrast to the brown skin that surrounded it. She looked at him, shook her head no, then turned and said something in a foreign language to the others outside of the room. When she did, Paul was surprised to see poking out from her braided hair an ear with a pronounced point at its top. He managed to tear his gaze from that sight to watch as the others approached, one of them practically running into the room. The person next to him gave up her chair to Ellie, who sat down and placed her hand on his arm. "I'm so glad you're finally awake. How do you feel?" she asked. "Well, my head hurts, but otherwise fine," Paul answered. Then more truthfully, "No, actually, I'm not fine. I'm freaked out. I'm fucking freaked out." He looked at her desperately, then looked over at the three strangers, staring at him from the doorway. "Where am I? Who are those people? Why are their ears like that?" He looked back at Ellie, tearfully continuing, "Ellie, what the hell is going on?" Ellie sighed deeply before answering, "I'm not from Iceland, Paul. I couldn't tell you about the world I'm from and who I am because you wouldn't have believed me, even if I had. We are in a place called Tulath, a land that exists, how do I put this, on top of yours, or they sit on top of each other. Your science might define it as a parallel dimension. I left here to find refuge in your world, but somehow when we kissed, it brought me back here, with you. Those people," she looked to the others, "are my family. Their ears are like that because they aren't human. They are elves, as I am." She then took her hands and pulled her hair back over her ears. Paul looked at her stunned. Somehow I never saw her ears before this, he realized, then understood that was by design. He reached up and touched the tip of one as she smiled down at him sympathetically. He lowered his hand and looked past her, his eyes unfocused. Okay, cool. So it's not a dream, not drugs. You sure it's not head trauma? He reached up towards his temple, not daring to touch it. My sister Bellarania is a healer. Thanks to her, you don't have any permanent damage, she said, looking at her sister with a nod. Sister? He said. He looked at Bellarania, then at the rest of her family, who he assumed were Ellie's mother and father. The mother had Ellie's pale skin. The father appeared Asian to Paul's eyes. Expecting his confusion, Ellie answered, "This isn't the human world, Paul. Genetics express themselves differently with elves. Things like skin color and facial features are more varied within our families compared to the more nuanced differences seen in yours." "But not all elves have heterochromia, I guess," Paul said, noticing the eyes of the parents. "No, that's rare among us too," Ellie said. Then the father said something to Ellie, who responded in her own tongue. Her mother said something and then Bellarania spoke while gesturing at Paul. This back and forth went on for a minute before Paul interrupted, saying to Ellie, "I guess you're not speaking Icelandic." "Sorry, Paul. Would you like to understand?" "You mean they can speak English? Yeah, it would be great to know what's going on." "Hold out your hand." Paul did so, and Ellie took it, turning his palm upward, and then she spit into it. "Hey," said Paul, slightly disgusted, then astonished when she uttered something and the saliva began to glow a bluish hue. She dipped her finger in the glowing spit and touched his lips, then one ear and the other, before placing it on his forehead, where he felt her trace a complex shape on his skin. While this was happening, he heard her father speaking. "Eltherea, ni seven else in our home, and now you give him the gift of our language?" It was as if her father had been speaking nonsense, then transitioned to English in the middle of his sentence. Except Paul knew that it wasn't English. Somehow there were two languages in his head now, and he understood what Ellie and her family had discussed before she performed the magic. Oh, right, and magic is real here, Paul thought, remembering he had already witnessed Ellie being lowered to the ground by mind-controlled vines. They had been talking about him, how he could stay the night and recover, but that they both must leave tomorrow and go back, with Ellie arguing that it would be too soon. Paul sensed their apprehension of him, which he thought ironic, given his situation. Wasn't he the stranger in a strange land? He gathered the courage to address them all, speaking in Elvish for the first time, surprised at how effortless it was. "I don't wish to be a burden. Thank you for bringing me into your home, and, Bellarania, I'm in your debt for healing my wounds. I promise that as soon as I am able, I will return to my own home, somehow." Ellie squeezed his hand, smiling at him, as her family looked at him with surprise. Bellarania said, "You spoke truth, Eltherea. I believe he is not like Levi." Ellie's father left the room without a word, then soon returned with bread and dried meat on a plate. He handed it to Paul, saying, "We have not introduced ourselves. I am Milongar, Eltherea's father." "And I am her mother, Luth Noel," said Ellie's mother. "And you now know Bellarania," motioning to the sister, who nodded at him without speaking. "Welcome to our village of Chaness." "I'm Paul," he said, and not knowing what else to say, added, "from Minneapolis." "Welcome, Paul, from Minneapolis. Now eat and rest. There will be more to tell in the morning." They left them then, Bellarania lingering for a moment, looking pointedly from Paul to Eltherea before exiting. "So your name's actually Eltherea," Paul said, now that they were alone. "Yes, well, Ellie just made more sense in your world. I've grown to like it. You can still use it," said Ellie/Eltherea, responding in English. "Ellie the elf, huh? But why Iceland? You've just learned that magic and elves are real, and that's your question?" She laughed. "Well, people thought my accent sounded Scandinavian, so I just went with it. Iceland seemed like the safer choice. Less chance of running into someone from there than Sweden, say." "Makes sense," responded Paul. He suddenly realized he was starving and tore into the food. He offered some to Ellie, who declined, and instead watched him with amusement. "You're able to eat. That's a good sign." "Don't get me wrong," he said through a mouthful of bread. "I still think I've lost my mind, but no sense going hungry, too." It was getting dark, and Paul sensed everyone else was turning in for the night. As he was still a bit dizzy, Ellie helped him to the bathroom. As they walked out into the main room, he realized they must be up pretty high, judging by the view through the windows. It was like a giant treehouse with a balcony encircling its exterior, and smaller rooms coming off the large one. More remarkable was how everything, from the floors to the furniture, all appeared to be extensions of the tree itself. With few exceptions, this house was alive. He took a look out at the open-air balcony and said, "I can see why you were staying in that tower." When they got back to the bedroom, he asked, "Where will you sleep?" "This is actually my room," she replied, "but I can find somewhere else." "No, please, would you stay with me?" Paul said, then added, "Not to do anything but sleep, I mean." "Okay," she said. Paul watched with fascination as vines appeared around the doorway, intertwining in a latticework to create a barrier. Then, even more captivating, he watched as Ellie took off her pants and just in her t-shirt and underwear climbed into bed with him. "Paul," she said quietly, "I really am sorry for lying to you." "I get why, though. I'm sorry for accusing you of drugging me." "I get that, too," she said. She went to kiss his lips, thought better of it, and kissed his neck. She then rested her head on his chest and draped an arm over his stomach, falling quickly to sleep. He lay there and stared out into the darkness. If he was home, having a woman lying next to him, holding him while they were in bed together, would be the only thing occupying his mind. Was she a woman? Thought Paul then. Is there a different term for female elf? His new language yielded none. Perhaps such distinctions weren't seen as important here. He traced the shape of her ear with a finger. If his eyes were deceiving him, did his touch? No, this is all real. His former reality had been shattered, and there was no picking up the pieces. As he felt the storm of anxiety over this fact brewing inside himself, some small glowing thing came into view. The fluttering something flew around chaotically before landing on Ellie's hair. Paul saw then what looked to be a butterfly, but this butterfly had bioluminescent wings. It cast a soft green glow on her wavy locks as it slowly raised and lowered them. Paul took the sight in as he had with everything in this world, a mixture of awe and disbelief. Unlike other startling revelations, this was calming, giving him a focus and quieting his thoughts. His breath became less shallow and began to keep pace with the butterfly's methodic opening and closing of its wings. Paul felt himself drifting off, while a song began floating through his brain. He dreamt he was falling, then he was not. Ellie had caught him, with arms made of branches. He looked up into her eyes, which faded away, replaced by sky and ground. The branches holding him snapped. He was falling again. Paul awoke with a start. His eyes adjusted as he looked around, realizing he was still in a treehouse in a village called Chaness, in a different world. It was early, a little before dawn, he supposed. He looked over and saw Ellie, now facing away from him. He wanted to reach out and stroke her hair, but instead brought his hand up to his head. The bump was gone, not even tender there now. He barely had slept, but given he wasn't expecting to at all, he was happy. Or something akin to happy. He was feeling a lot of things that it was hard to sort out. He watched Ellie's back as it rose and fell with her breath. Unsure of what to do, he lay there, waiting for her to wake up. When she finally did, she rolled over, looked at him, and gave him a sleepy, "Good morning." She then got up, and with her back to him, undressed, seemingly unbothered by his presence. He didn't know what to make of this. Was this the stage their relationship was at? It didn't seem likely. Perhaps elves have a different sense of propriety than humans? Regardless of the reason, he did his best to play it cool in the presence of her naked perfection. She grabbed some clothing from a shelf, sat on the bed, and pulled on leggings that looked to be hand-woven. Of course, he realized, it all would be. Then a lightweight shirt and a tunic over that. She laced up a pair of boots that stopped just below the knee, then stood up and grabbed her army coat that was hanging on the bedpost. Paul grinned as she took a button off of it and pinned it to her tunic. On it were 5 identical generic figures like those on a men's bathroom sign. "I love the Suburbs logo," Ellie said, admiring the pin on her elven clothing. She then yanked the covers off of Paul, who was thankful it wasn't a few minutes earlier, saying, "Now, I think you need to get those clothes washed. You can borrow something from my father, unless you want to go naked today." "I choose clothes," Paul answered with mock uncertainty. She returned with the clothing, and Paul proceeded to undress, following her example. Her lack of any reaction helped him feel oddly okay about this unfamiliar situation. She then assisted with some of the fastenings and ties, for which he was grateful. Malongar didn't own an extra pair of boots, so Paul was stuck wearing his Chuck Taylors. He thought this incongruity made him look silly, but Ellie said he looked great, so he walked out of the room confidently. They joined Malongar and Bellarania out in the common room for breakfast, which consisted of bread, fried eggs, and strawberries the size of apples. Ellie's father looked at Paul and told him he was pleased his clothing were a good fit on him. He did, however, take exception to Eltherea's strange brooch, saying it was not appropriate for elves to possess objects from other place. Ellie dismissively said, "Oh, father," which ended that conversation. "How did you two sleep?" asked her sister, adding, "if at all." "We slept well, my sister, thank you," Ellie said irritably, looking then to her father. Malongar continued to cut his eggs in silence. Eventually he said, "You will be going to the island today?" "We will go tomorrow. Paul still needs time to recover from his injury." The silence that followed made Paul uncomfortable, so he broke it by asking where Luth Noel was. "She is dwelling today," Malongar answered, and said nothing more. Ellie looked at Paul and quietly told him in English, "I'll explain later." "Elvish, please," said her father gruffly. "Yes, father," she said in her language with exasperation. "Now, if you'll excuse us." Soon Paul and Ellie were descending the stairs that circled the tree. Naturally, they were formed from branches spaced as evenly as any regular steps, and even had a railing. Paul asked how they managed to carry him up all that way when he was unconscious. It looked to be 30 feet from the ground, but apparently he had been lifted up by a rope and pulley normally used to bring up food. He was glad he hadn't been awake for that indignity. As Paul stepped downwards, he marveled at the surrounding scenery. Bungalow-style homes perched high in the branches of massive trees were all around, each of similar design but with elements denoting different occupants. Some were adorned with banners, some with what looked like colored globes hanging from ropes. A few of the homes were connected by suspended bridges. When they reached the bottom, he saw that there were some buildings on the ground, but largely Chaness was a village in the trees. He asked Ellie why they lived up so high, and she said that the valley had experienced floods in its past, and the ancestors, in their wisdom, moved upwards. "I notice how everything in your home is an extension of the tree. Did you make all that with your magic?" he asked, awed by the thought. "The houses are living things, constantly changing, and I do guide that process, but no, most of these homes have been here for many, many years." "So you're not the only one who can do that plant thingy?" "Every elf has the ability, but not all have trained as I have. Think of it this way, anyone can take a hammer and chisel to marble, but few will end up with Michelangelo's David. That's not me bragging. I'm not saying I'm the best among my people, but I'm also no slouch. Anyway, there are many trades, magical and otherwise, practiced in the village. Everyone here has their part to play in the community." As they walked along, the other elves would smile at Ellie, then give Paul an uneasy look. He didn't sense outright hostility, but he didn't exactly feel welcome either. They would just return to their work, carrying bags of things, weaving cloth, guiding horses, pulling carts of grain. One elf walked past, carrying an entire deer on her back. Meanwhile, children ran around, playing games Paul couldn't guess the rules of. He thought of his own rural background, growing up among crop fields, but never feeling much about any of it. Neighbors would help each other sometimes, sure, but it wasn't like this. Here was a close-knit community that relied on all to play their part to survive. He could understand Ellie's pain at having to leave here, though the reason remained a mystery to him. They passed a group of children shooting arrows into targets painted with animal silhouettes placed against bales of straw. There was an elf instructing them who appeared to be Ellie's age. Wait, is Ellie 18 in human years or elf years? How do they compare? Maybe she's like 100 in my years? Panicking, Paul quickly jumped off this train of thought. "Calarian!" Ellie shouted. The elf looked up from one of the student archers and walked over with a confidence Paul could only dream of possessing. "This is my most trusted friend in Chaness. They even saved my life once." "Twice, you mean," said Calarian. "I think your time in other place has dulled your senses." "If you are speaking of that squeezer in Wolf-Tooth Woods, I had the situation well in hand. I was just about to enthrall it before you jumped in," she replied. "Is that so?" they said, then quickly got behind Ellie, grabbing her around the waist and pinning her arms to her sides, saying, "And how were you planning to do that without the use of your hands?" Ellie smashed the back of her head against Calarian's face, who let go their hold, then turned, grabbed them by the shoulders, falling backwards and flipping them over herself, before quickly jumping on them and straddling their chest. Okay, you've made your point," they said, to which Ellie laughed, got up and held out her hand, helping Calarian up. They tenderly touched their nose and said, "Your time there has not dulled your speed, at least, but I am no squeezer either." "Fair enough," replied Ellie, who added, "Shall I send Bellarania to tend to your nose?" "It's fine," they said with obvious annoyance. Calarian then looked at Paul, who had been watching the whole incident with surprise, and said to him, "So, this is your human." They reached out and grabbed Paul's arm, giving it a shake that spread to his entire body. "You are timid and quiet, not like Levi. I have no fear of you." "Okay," Paul said quietly and timidly. "His name is Paul, Calarian, and he is stronger than you think," Ellie said, reinflating Paul's ego slightly. "I mean no offense," they said, smiling. "If you have Eltherea's trust, then you have mine," they said, holding out their hand, which Paul shook, relieved to have this intimidating elf on his side. Paul then noticed, just beyond them, was the group of young archers, having abandoned their bows and arrows for this scene instead. Calarian turned to the children and motioned them to get back to their target practice. "I must return to the lesson. You will be at Storyfire tonight?" they said, addressing Ellie. "Oh, I forgot. Tonight is a raven moon. Yes, we will be there. I have missed hearing the storyteller. It has been too long." The three said their goodbyes, and Ellie and Paul continued their walk around Chaness. It was still sinking in for Paul that all he was experiencing was actually real, but much still eluded his grasp. With little choice, he tried to understand these things through the filter of his former life from his other world. Like when Eltherea had introduced Calarian, Paul was initially confused, but then thought of all those artists who cultivated an androgynous persona. He guessed many of them would appreciate an alternative to the rigidity of just he or she. Then there were the mysteries that could not be resolved by simply knowing the language. After all, it didn't come with definitions. What the hell is a squeezer? A storyfire? A raven moon? And who was Levi? Apparently, he was another human that people here feared, but Paul knew nothing beyond that. He had many questions, but remembering something earlier that Ellie had promised to explain, he asked, "What is dwelling?" She grabbed his hand and redirected their walk, and said, "I can show you, or at least show you a part to help you understand." They walked to a tree with a small structure in its branches. On the first step of the spiral stairway leading to it sat an elf reading a book, who, when she saw the two approaching, set it down and stood up. She placed a hand on the hilt of a knife that was at her hip and looked at them intensely. "Hello, Eretha. I would like to check on my mother," Ellie said, surprised at the manner of her greeting. "You may go, but not the human. That is forbidden, which you well know, Eltherea," Eretha responded flatly. Ellie sighed. "Of course. Thank you for guarding her, Eretha." She turned and walked away, bringing Paul by the hand. When they got some distance, she turned back, watched as Eretha sat back down and picked up her book, then took a wide path to the back of the tree. She then hugged Paul, and soon they were both ascending, as vines that had encircled them lifted them up to a branch near the room. Paul, doing his best to pretend that was a normal thing that just happened, looked into the window and saw Ellie's mother lying motionless on a bed in there. "Is she sleeping?" he asked quietly. "The mind that is currently in her body is, but she is elsewhere," Ellie answered. Seeing Paul's confused look, she continued, "Elves have the ability to switch consciousnesses with animals, which we do to help locate game, scout areas that are beyond our reach, or, these days, unfortunately, to keep an eye out for threats to the village. The animal of choice is typically a bird, but we can become whatever animal that suits the task at hand. We put the animals to sleep, what we call enthralling, so that their minds are unaware of the change. Enthralling is done by touch, but dwelling can be done within sight of the animal. If an elf is alone, they will first enthrall the animal and then perform the dwelling magic, which is easier if we already have the animal's trust. Otherwise, another elf is needed to immediately put the mind of the animal to sleep once it has been transferred into the elf's body. So your mother's body has a sleeping animal brain in it right now? Paul asked incredulously. She Freaky Friday'd a bird? Naturally, Ellie didn't get the reference, so Paul did his best to summarize the plot of the 1976 movie that he barely remembered. I don't think that sounds much like this magic, and elves cannot dwell in other elves. It only works with animals. So have you dwelled? Yes, many of us have. It's one of our duties in maintaining the welfare of Chaness. You've been flying around as a bird? That must be amazing, Paul said, trying to imagine what that must be like. It also didn't make much sense, like consciousness was just a floating vapor that could fill any skull like a container. Just add it to the list of insane things I must accept here, thought Paul. It is, but of all the animals, it is the most difficult to master. When you do, though, and you understand how to ride the winds and can soar above the tallest cliffs, it's like nothing else. Hungry work, though. I'm always starving when I awaken in my body. She looked at Paul, smiled thoughtfully, then said, Speaking of that, I think it's time for lunch. Afterwards, we can go to the river Eltherea, which is a reflection of your Mississippi. Except here you can go for a swim and come out cleaner than when you went in. I feel like fishing, though, if you're okay with that. And later, when the sun sets, she said, while putting her arms around him as vines encircled them both, you will hear the story of why I fled my world and ended up in yours.